So hello and welcome to this webinar. It's a webinar run by Intersex Human Rights Australia, which is a national intersex-led health and human rights organisation in Australia. The session today is being very kindly delivered by Dr. Agli Zavros-Orr, who is the president of Intersex Human Rights Australia and also has a doctorate in education. And her doctorate studies focused on the ethics of care, school leadership, teachers' work, and supportive school environments. Agli is currently teaching at Southern Cross University, and Agli has also served as the Victorian representative and Tasmanian representative for Intersex Peer Support Australia, and is a member of the Victorian Government's Intersex Advisory Group. I think it's going to be a really exciting session. And I think maybe, Agli, I think I should hand it over to you to introduce yourself and also to acknowledge country.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Let us know if you can't hear me, and we can adjust. I can adjust my microphone or my voice at this end. Thank you, Morgan, for your introduction. Just a correction, not the president, I wish, but the chair of ERA. And I share the role with Aileen Kennedy, who did the previous webinar. It's an honour to be part of Intersex Human Rights Australia. I think I've benefited greatly, and some of what I'm going to share with you this evening has come about as a result of the benefits that I have gained by being part of the community, both the Intersex Human Rights Australian community, but also the general community that's represented through IPSA, Intersex Peer Support Australia. I've also learned a lot by working in the Victorian context as a community representative on the Victorian Government's Intersex Expert Advisory Group and the work we're currently doing in Victoria on prohibition. And what that's brought to my attention, and you will see the themes unfold through my presentation, that we need to be thinking about how we educate and how we introduce this very important topic that's been subjugated for a number of reasons. And so most of us, especially the people with lived experience like myself, we've had to work extremely hard in our life to access information and to better understand ourselves, our variation, our place in the world, and so forth. So the motivation for the title is about raising awareness and visibility in a positive way, in a way that is inclusive, in a way that changes the outcomes for young people. We can't go back and change the past, but we can certainly start from today to change the future. Before I go on, I want to begin by acknowledging the country that we're on Wurundjeri country. And there's a little bit of information about the place that I'm on. Part of acknowledging country is being open, willing to recognize self in place and how the self impacts on the place and the community that the self is part of. And for me, doing this work is part of a commitment to live and work authentically in the place that I inhabit. I'm originally from Cyprus. I'm a migrant. I'm a refugee, or had refugee status in my own country because of war. But we were sponsored to come to Australia, and there have been many, many benefits afforded to me as a result of migrating to this country. benefits that sometimes aren't afforded to others. And I think it's important that we think about the different ways that we engage with people in our community and how we afford them the human rights that we have. And so part of my authentic walking on country is about working on human rights and thinking critically and reflectively and reflexively on issues that are really important for improving life and the quality of life for everyone. And intersex is an intersectional issue. It is an issue that's significant to people across culture. It is significant to people for people in the past, in the present, and in the future. We've been part of this planet. Intersex is part of, maybe not by that word, but certainly people with intersex variations or people who have been born with variations in sex characteristics have been part of this planet. And so it's important that we start to recognize, and that's the first step in raising awareness and visibility, I think. If you would like to acknowledge the country that you're on, you can do so in the chat and let people know where you are. You can let people know, what's special about the country that you're on, and people can sort of, whilst they're listening to me, they might, get bored of listening to my voice, so they might read about where different participants come from on this, in this beautiful country of ours. Part of working authentically on country is, I think, and in education, we talk about embedding Indigenous perspectives, being authentic, being communicative, letting people know how you walk and live and work as part of changing historical practices where a lot of things remain hidden and people don't fully understand why people come, why, what do they bring? So, this is an image that I've been working on. I'm currently working on a chapter on my methodologies in working in this topic. But I'll let you read. I'm not going to read for you. So there's some text there that you can read, and there'll be text throughout that you can read as provocation, as thought-provoking. It might help you to consider something from a different perspective. At times I will draw on the text, but I'm generally sort of, will let you read any information that's on the slides with connections through what I'm going to share with you. So I think, the social justice lens, I've made that clear in terms of my introduction, that I come from a very strong social justice background in education, in thinking about children's rights. As we know, children don't have legal rights. They have guardians, parents, carers that look after those rights. And they hope that, or they I suppose, they expect, sorry, got a bit emotional there. They expect that those that are in care or those that have duty of care will put their rights forward and work in their best interest. Working in this area, it can be really hard. It can be, sort of triggering. It can bring up a lot of emotions, especially if you have lived experience like I do, and people who have worked in this area as well, who have lived experience. Doing this work can be triggering. So I like to bring a bit of joy to my work. I come from an early childhood background and a drama and arts background. So bringing art, creativity, and joy is a really important part of taking care of myself, but also communicating in different ways that also gives access to people that, do learn in different ways. So that's important. For me, it's important that time is given. So scholarship and good scholarship. And forgive me for the use of the word good. It's a tricky word, but in this instance, what I mean by that word is scholarship that takes time, that is focused, that is thoughtful, that considers different perspectives in informing the way that we move forward. And as I said earlier, the way that we walk on this country, so that we are walking in a manner that is adding rather than depleting to the quality of life. So we come to the topic of intersex, and many of you may have read up about the topic. You may have heard the word before. It's a word that has a wide diversity. It's the I is complex. It represents a number of people from different walks of life. You may have heard that there are 40 variations. Maybe there are more, and ones that we don't know about yet. You may have heard that 1.7% of the population are born with an intersex variation. And if we think about that, it's most likely that we have people around us that are intersex or have been born with a variation in sex characteristics. As I said, it's an intersectional concern. And so people who are born with the variation may come from different cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, may operate in different languages, religion, identify with different racial groups. They may identify differently in terms of gender from the binary of male and female. And class. And class is a really important one because there's, I think it's about access to resources. It's about access to support services. It's about access to medical treatment if that's necessary. So that's part of it as well. And for some, there may be experiences of shame, secrecy, and silence. But this can be experienced differently across different generation and age groups. So when we think about the word or the letter I in LGBTQIA+, we need to think about its diversity and the complexity. And with that complexity, there is also the challenge posed in language. The words intersex and endosex have been used to differentiate, sort of people born with variations in sex characteristics and those that are born cisgender or don't have variations or may not know. Like for myself, up to the age of 17, I lived in the endosex world, if you like. And it was until 17 that I then started to, have my body being categorized differently. So, I have a foot in both of those, are the worlds that these words come from. We have medical language like disorder and difference and variations. And, people may understand these words differently. And so it's important to think about how language situates us and how language allows us to understand what's going on. It's historical, it's jurisdictional, and there's jurisdictional differences in language. And especially if you work in the academic space or if you're reading information on the web, you may hear the word intersexuality, you may hear other words being used, and they are jurisdictional words that have evolved over time, because language evolves. For people to explain and to make meaning about their lived experiences. It is an umbrella term, and in some instances, it's a contested term. So it's important for us to know. The language is situated in the personal, in the social, in the political, in the legal and the human rights space as well. So how it's, there's so much in this space that an individual has to get their head around and understand. And even when we're reading up about it, where the language moves from space to space. So people migrate or appropriate terms from one space to another. And so people who are reading are having to, process texts by trying to figure out, where did these words come from? What do they mean? In terms of then trying to make sense. So I have a background in English and literacy. So language is really important, and language is significantly connected to health, well-being, and prosperity. And so it's important that we think about language and how language situates us and allows us to access and make use of information. So you can already start to see the theme evolving about why education is important here. This is just flagging the paper that has partially informed this presentation and has informed the title of the presentation. It's fresh off the press, but it's a paper that started a long time ago. It's a paper that slowly evolved with me as I've tried to make sense of what intersex means, all the various words that have been used along the way to talk about my body and to situate my body in terms of different discourses and practices, medical and otherwise. In the background is one of my paintings. I paint, and it's inspired by this Australian landscape, the renewal that comes after a fire. How the bush renews itself. There's a hidden wisdom that lies in the land. And, once something, we see something like fires being destructive, but there's something there that rejuvenates. There's an energy. And I try to capture that as part of my journey of rejuvenation, my journey of, making meaning and finding new and having growth in the process, rather than, sort of feeling depressed and getting stuck in the rut of the lived experience that I've had. So in terms of then thinking about this, it's thinking about where we've come to, and, and for various reasons, the conversation has centered in particular spaces more than others, the medical space, the legal space, the political space, for reasons that are important, because we need that top-down pressure to actually affect change and reform. But we also need bottom-up pressure in order to make sense of. And for the work that's been done in the medical, legal, and political space in terms of change and advocacy, for it to have efficacy in the long term for the next generation, and even for people who are now living. It's important for us to see that change is happening, that we're not stuck in the past. I think that's an important message that we need to carry. And that's aligns with, or for me, with the principles of social justice, equity, and inclusion, which are really important to keep in mind, and why it is important to bring awareness and visibility to the topic, especially in education spaces. And when I say education, I've worked from the baby's room in the early learning centers right through to university level. So I've worked with adults who are trying to make sense of their identities when they come to university, and they're trying to figure out who they are after, compulsory education has finished, and they get a sense of freedom, and they want to find, figure out, who am I? How do I fit in the world? What kind of work do I want to do? What kind of impact do I want to make? And so I've, some of the topics that I will be raising actually are important across the whole education sector. And so think openly about some of the ideas. Yes, they might link to early years or primary or secondary, but their educational principles go across all aspects, and even in our personal lives, because I strongly believe that the child is not very far from the surface. In terms of how I work, very much, as I've said to you, I work from a social justice perspective and very much influenced by Paulo Freire in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this spiral diagram, which has been used by a number of different organizations across, since its conception, or since the Paulo Freire started thinking about oppression and how oppression affects particular groups, marginalized groups, vulnerable populations. It's a way of centering ourselves and thinking about the issues. And I love the fact that it starts with the experience of the participants, the people who live with the issue and the concern, and then thinking from there, how do we move from that center out to then defining action, and what that action might look like. And before that, thinking about the strategies, and in some places thinking and practicing the strategies and thinking about their efficacy and how they're going to impact intentionally or unintentionally on the participants. Thinking about new information that comes to light through the efforts of people in organizations like ERA, IPSA, advocates, people who take the time to share their story on radio or on television. And you may have seen people on Insight or You Can't Ask That, talking or sharing their stories. They're putting themselves in that space to educate all of us about what it means to be born with a variation in sex characteristics. And so new information keeps coming, and it's up to all of us to be engaging with this new information, but critically, reflectively, and also if we're working in the theoretical space, to be looking at the theories that we're using. As Morgan said, I'm working in teacher education, so I'm constantly telling my students, have you reflected on where this theory has come from? Piaget's theory, Freud's theory, Skinner's theory on behavior. For those of you that have an education background or have heard these names, thinking critically about where the theory has come from and what implications that theory has as we bring it to inform practice. And you can see in this space, I work with, the complexity, and you'll see that coming out later. There's so many other, spaces that interact. So knowledge doesn't just come from one discipline, it's interdisciplinary. And especially in terms of intersex, we can see, if you engage with the literature or the information that comes about, there's information that comes from the political space, the scientific space, the social space, the medical space. And an individual, as I said, has to navigate through this space, but also those that are seeking to provide support, education, and care. It's a complex world in which this topic is evolving. And so it's good to keep in mind where the language is coming from, what the ideas are, where the ideas are coming from, what the intent is behind the idea, how the ideas are going to interact with each other, and what impact they will have. I run an organization called, or a small business, to try and pass the message of diversity and inclusion. And in the work that I do, and this has been informed by my practice across a number of years, too many years to mention. These ideas are really central in how we work with each other. And as I said in the previous slide, it's about people's lived experiences. And these experiences are linked to how we feel mentally, how we feel physically, our cognitive thinking and cognitive capacities. You know that when you're tired or when you're stressed, your cognitive capacities may be impacted by. But if you then introduce other elements, your cognitive capacities are also going to be impacted by those experiences. We are social creatures. We are very much about identity work. Intersex is not an identity, but we are all engaged in identity work with each other, by ourselves, in the world that we live. And for some of us, we may also be engaged in the academic space on learning. You know, academic for me connects from birth right through. You know, when you're engaged with education or educational practices or activities, there's an academic element involved to that. And, you know, for me, so when I came to be working with the community and became aware of the community's efforts, and my first meeting with the community was the second coming together to affirm the Darlington Statement. And it was an emotional experience, but such an eye-opening experience that brought so much heart, joy, a feeling of, you know, acceleration, excitement. But I started to see how all of these themes that I've been working on in my professional life sit with everyone differently, and how people make sense differently of their lived experiences. But, you know, we're always figuring out, you know, how we feel, how we think, what we think, and so forth. And the Darlington Statement, for those of you that don't know it, this is the paper one. But you can go to darlington.org and you can read it. If you haven't yet affirmed it, do so. But in affirming it, think about, you know, what does affirming something like this mean? Is there a sense of responsibility to do something with the, you know, the information that you've acquired by reading the document? But it's the community's way of saying, this is what we need. This is what's important to us. And one of the areas that's important is education, awareness, and employment. And that's taken up the focus of my work, and, you know, it's reflected in this presentation tonight. Oh, excuse me, I'll just take a breath and you can have a little bit of a read. I'm being a bit provocative here, aren't I? Here's a newborn baby in the arms of the mum. This is the work that I do in early years, is to connect with children and families, and to think about that start in life and what that means. And when I was doing the presentation and I came across this image, and all the images that I've used are in a slide at the end that you know, you can go and read. This is from an article that is about, you know, a newborn baby that with an intersex variation. But I think about this relationship in the education space, and I think about what comes between this newborn and whoever the caregiver is, mom, dad, uncle, auntie, brother, sister, grandma, grandpa. There are lots of relationships, but there are other relationships that also enter into the space. And it's hard to come to terms with how they enter into this space, especially when you're working to promote health and well-being and support someone to thrive, to see that some of the ways that services, medical services, etc., enter into this space in a problematic way. And the work that we're doing, as we said earlier, in Victoria and elsewhere, will hopefully to change that and try and bring some more humanity into this space and give families and newborn babies time to breathe, time to figure things out, time to work out what the best options are. And I'll come to that a little bit further. But, you know, hopefully you've read, you know, about some of the things that are of concern to us in this space, how young people are understood, how their bodies are understood in a physical way. But also, you know, understanding that, you know, that might happen for a baby, but for some children, this is an unfolding story as they grow up, how they feel in their bodies, and then how their bodies come to reflect their biology in physical ways. For girls, through puberty, having their periods, and so forth. So it's not something that's of concern in the early years or for babies. It's actually something that is a concern across all stages of life. This emotional work. So forgive me if I choke a little bit as I go through this. I'm going to move. This is a young person. You may have read the book written by Lockman and Lockman on raising Rosie, a baby with CAH. And in Rosie's story, we see the narrative changing. We see the narrative changing where parents are willing to give their child the gift of time, the gift to breathe, to form relationships, to better understand themselves, and to gain knowledge and wisdom about their body generally, but also about their variation, and then to make decisions about what they want done. And that's really important. And the emphasis here is on some very important ideas: personal autonomy, personal informed consent. And this is an important part of what we are driving in the human rights space. And the importance of education is informing that, working in partnership with children and families and communities to bring knowledge and wisdom to this space about what intersex means, so that both parents and children can make better decisions. I think that's an important focus. And that work is impactful. It means that we are allowing an individual to come to terms with what is happening to them, and then to be able to make decisions that they can live with. Ultimately, the decisions are the individuals to make, but they're decisions that they need to make, and that's important. The other side of the coin is that in education, we are also educating others, like parents, doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, psychologists, counselors, lawyers, and general citizens. And so it's important that we think about, it's not just that we're educating this young person and giving them knowledge, we are also educating the rest of society and allowing that society to catch up and to be thinking differently and making room and space for this individual to live and thrive, just like everyone else has a right to. Part of the process and many of you may have come to this, is the community has been working at lengths to try and bring knowledge and wisdom. But also, I share these sort of images with you, which are texts produced by, from the community, including the flag. And if you don't know the story of the flag, created, from the community, Morgan Carpenter had a big part to play in its creation. It's worth you going to the ERA website and just thinking about what does the flag represent. What do flags represent in general, but the story behind the flag that is worth knowing. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention here is that a lot of effort is been made to educate from the community out. And one of the important things that I want to bring to your attention as part of this topic of raising awareness and visibility, there needs to be work taken up in different spaces, especially educative spaces, around the topic. I often hear, oh, what does intersex mean? Is there any information? What is that information? Where can I find it? It's really hard when you are in this space to be always in an educative role. It's part of having great allies, I think, is where our allies take the initiative and go looking for and learning about. And I'm probably speaking to the converted here. So thank you if you've been one of those people that have taken the effort to view information, read information that's been made available by our community. There is a cost, as I said earlier, associated when people put themselves out there and produce content for the purpose of educating. So in this slide, I also want to acknowledge, and not everyone's acknowledged here, but I want to acknowledge all the people that have worked to bring knowledge and awareness. And that knowledge and awareness has significantly impacted on my life and my health and well-being. So I think it's important to just have a minute to recognize that. A lot of this is also available from our ERA webpage. If you go to What is Intersex, there's a lot of information there that can help you in your own time, in your own space, to process what it means. One of the nicest experiences that I've had is watching Steph Lum's video, Finding Pride. And I think part of that message that I was talking about earlier in terms of bringing joy, I think Steph brings a lot of joy in how she walks and talks and shares knowledge. And the work that Steph does in the community is significant, but I think if you take the time to also listen to and watch her poem, her walking poem, I like to call it, it's inspiring, and it certainly is educative. And if you're an English teacher or if you're working in education, what better text to have, and to bring that into your classroom to share with your students. Google. It's another educative space, isn't it? And for many intersex people and stories that I've listened to and information that has been given, a lot of us find our way to understanding first by the great big web that's dark and mysterious, and you never know where it's going to take you. It's a bit like a rabbit hole, and you feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland, when you start to look for things. And for many of us, it's the starting point for education because we've not had it elsewhere. And so when we come to a point where we do have access and we have some words, we start to Google, we start to search, and we start to look for. And some of the information that you can see in the circles, bubbles of information, I call them, that float around us, you know, can both be positive, but can also be triggering and can raise concerns. And if you're educating yourself mainly through Google or searches, it can be quite traumatic, because you may come up with information that you're not able to unpack on your own. And then who do you turn to? Especially if there's been secrecy and silence around you. Who do you talk to about, you know, things like XY female? Yes, I'm an XY female. I was born with XY chromosomes. But what does that mean? Who's going to help me to understand that? Googling that, as in the first instance, it was like such a huge load of information that came flying at me from this dark space called the web. How do I process that? Can I go to my teachers? Is there content in the curricula that will give me the language to start processing and understanding? Can I talk to my friends? Can I talk to my parents, my family? These are issues that are really important, you know, and that sits in context with all the other public pedagogies of what it means to be a male or what it means to be a female. We just have to walk into Target or Kmart or even Coles or any chemist, and, you know, there's information everywhere about maleness and femaleness. And if you've been told that that's in question, then you think, where do I fit? Where's the stuff that belongs to me? You know, where do I fit in this context? Like I said, it's not about gender, but it is connected to identity work. It triggers stuff. And it, you know, if you don't have the right information, it can become really complex and, you know, traumatizing to try and figure out what this actually means and what it's actually about. And whilst the web has its uses, it can also create issues, and issues that can have significant impact on health and well-being, you know, participation, you know, in all sorts of ways. So it's important for us, when we think about education, we think about school, but there are other educative forces that compete with the work that we do in educative spaces like schools. So there's some things that I focus on, and I'd like to bring to your attention in terms of thinking about, well, how do we move forward? Having identified some of the issues, how do we move forward? One of the things that I think, and I've learned through my work in early years, is stopping and listening to children, and critically thinking about what they're telling us. The image on the side is from Malaguzzi. You may know that name as it's connected to Reggio and Reggio approaches to early childhood. But it's about the 100 languages of children, the many, many different ways that they tell us things with their hands, with their eyes, with their bodies, you know, how they hug us or how they push us away, how they choose to be in spaces or how they avoid spaces. I have 2 children on my own. One of them is adverse to going anywhere near a doctor and a doctor with a needle. And when he was little, he would pull me away, you know, back in the car, mommy, back in the car, no go doctor, mommy, no go doctor, mommy. And it's, you know, what do? I need to listen. I need to understand, what is my child telling me? And that's an important part. And, you know, in early years, we work with pre-service teachers to try and bring them awareness and sensitivity to working in this space. And as I said earlier, you know, what we do has intended and unintended outcomes. And so listening, thinking critically is an important aspect of education, and thinking about people's diverse needs or young children's diverse needs. The second part to moving forward and thinking in education around this stuff. And I wrote a chapter on this called Caring for Children with Variations in Sex Characteristics in a social justice publication published by Multiverse, which was trying to figure out how do we work with the complexities of children's lived experiences, what they tell us, what they share through the stories in their drawings, in their words, in their play with each other, in the play with us, and so forth. I think it's really important to figure out how we listen and understand, and to then start to think across that. If we're working as educators, what are the common themes that are coming through? What are the diverse ideas that are coming through in what they share with us? And this is how we start to engage with and hear the intersectional themes as they emerge from children's lived experiences. And this is true for every child, whether they are born with variation in sex characteristics or otherwise. The next one is thinking about and evaluating and reforming contexts and conditions that specifically render invisible the lived experiences of marginalized groups, individuals, and communities. And the image here is from the United Nations campaign on free and equal. But if we think about free and equal, we need to think about how we work with marginalized groups, how we include them, how we educate, how we work from their perspective in defining what we mean by education, how we educate. Because as I said earlier, it is an intersectional topic with intersectional themes woven through the lived experience of people who have the courage to step forward and share their stories. So if we then flip it back and think about the individual and how they process in education, across and even outside of education, the process of imagining and reimagining the self is part of the work that we do. And there are discursive frames that intersect when an individual does that work. But what knowledge and information do we bring to children and individuals that help them to navigate these spaces and to make decisions that are meaningful, or to make meaning from the breadth of information that's out there about bodies and genders and sexualities, and how to be a man and how to be a woman, how to be a good man, how to be a good woman, or how to be a good girl, or how to be a good boy. There's so much that floats around this space that can really be confusing and in some cases traumatizing. And this is what brings children with particular lived experience at risk of thinking about, considering, or even making attempts at their own life. And this is information from Relationships Australia, but there's a lot of other information out there on this topic. And I just want to bring to your attention that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed. And that issue is, I think, can be addressed through education by making available information that allows every individual including individuals born with variations in sex characteristics. I've lost my train of thought. Brings to them information that helps them understand and make meaning. But I think also creating spaces that are safe, that are understanding, that spaces that hold knowledge and have insight. In schools, it may be the chaplain, it may be the principal, counselor. They can support children if they do have questions. And it's really important to know that intersex goes across all sectors. So if you think about homeless, there's probably people who are born with variations in sex characteristics who are homeless. People who identify as LGBTQ, people who are heterosexual, people who are in situations of domestic violence may also be someone that has a variation in sex characteristics. So there's layers, and so you can start seeing the complexity that an individual has to work through, that puts them at risk. But for us as a community, as an educative community, in all different spaces, we need to be starting to think about how do we bring knowledge and wisdom that's available in the system? How do we think critically and reflectively about that knowledge? And how do we bring it to inform the work that we do to mitigate the risks? And in particular on this important issue that I think we can resolve. I think, we need to be doing everything to make young people, any person, feel that they do have choices, that they have somewhere to go. I think it's really important, and it's an important part of the heading of awareness and visibility, is bringing that awareness, and for us to know that yes, there are intersex people as part of these vulnerable populations that we're often funding projects. And one of the issues is that often funding that's directed to these issues does not think mindfully of the needs of people who are in those populations who are born with variations in sex characteristics. And that's something that we're working to change. And I hope our allies can work with us in that direction. I'm going to flip to, I am a critical autoethnographer. An autoethnographer is someone who works to understand context, conditions, populations, but they also bring themselves into that as a participant, as a member. This is one of my drawings. It's dark, but it also has an element of light associated with it. And this comes from an article by Moss, which talks about a young woman born with a variation. It's called Swires, and that is my variation. I was born with Swires syndrome. And in the article, there was this image of a young person sitting in a hospital bed. And that image triggered and reminded me of my lived experience. And I did a drawing, which you see, and I've changed the colors because the drawing is very personal. And so, but I also embedded a photo of myself, which you can see on the pad. And that's a photo before things changed, before the intervention. And what I thought about reading this story, and in later years I met the person, I thought about, what it felt like to be sitting on the hospital bed as a young person, 17 years of age, having completed most of my education, most of it, which was of no use. in fact, it was quite problematic because I was given to understand something through both biology and sex education that did not relate to what was happening to me. And so in that instance, everything that I knew went out the window, and I had to start anew to understand the world and my place in it. And so when I saw the image in the article, I started to draw. It was part of the work that I do as a critical autoethnographer is called memory work, and drawing is part of memory work. And so drawing, inspired by this, and then thinking and playing with creative methods, started to connect with all of the different aspects that are associated with an experience at a point in time. And then I think about other children who have been educated in particular ways, who may get to a point in their puberty who have a similar experience. And then what does that mean? How do they cope and make sense of that? The title of the article was quite problematic. When teenage girl finds out they're genetically male, what do you do with that? When you've been raised in a particular way. The term that was thrown around by the doctor that I heard, and I have very broken memories of how I got to hear it. But the doctor said to my parents, like a boy, but not a boy. So what do you do with that? And how do you live with that and make sense of that as you go through what they deem a life-saving treatment? You move from, a medical emergency as a young person to, a surgery that's going to make all the difference. But then you find out that really it didn't make, yes, it may have made a difference, but there's a whole lot of other issues that come with that treatment, and very little information, support, guidance about how to cope. And we know from research, and in the journal where my article is being published, there's another article by Sanders and al. That talk about the experiences of, other intersex people born with variations in sex characteristics that relate to depression, anxiety, PTSD, and how this places them at risk in different aspects of their life. And what we understand when we engage with that is that a lot of the factors are associated with responses. It may not have a lot to do with what that variation or sometimes the treatment, but it can have a lot to do with the responses of others, of family, of friends, of just being left isolated, not having information. It's, that can cause, that can do harm. And so I think it's important. This is part of my journal. And for me, whilst this might look, this dark element to this, I think it's a way that people survive. And so part of the message here is, how do we, through education, create spaces for children to process and understand themselves and what they're going through? As a teacher, I used journals quite a lot, and I gave children across all years, even at university, opportunities to journal. Sometimes at university, we might cover topics that, are really difficult. And, we run through the lecture, we complete the topic. Do we give our students time to maybe journal and reflect and think about? I've had students that I've counseled after lectures who have said, actually that content was a little bit triggering. It really impacted on me, especially when we're talking about issues relating to health and well-being in education. And, sometimes when I have talked about intersex and intersex lived experience, it's important to be mindful of how the knowledge we're bringing, how we're working with knowledge, it can be triggering. So, there's another message that I'm bringing here is how do we create spaces for supporting our students to be reflective and to process what they're hearing in more than just their assessment work. Learning, I think for me, is about creating different ways of processing information. And so I think, for my university colleagues, we need to think creatively and think about how do we bring other ways of working and thinking and acting. And I have started doing some of that work with colleagues at Monash, with pre-service teachers on intersex. And we'll continue doing that work, but how do we think about how we train professionals to process information that brings an element of humanness and connects them to the themes in more than just completing assessment work. And we know, especially in teacher education, that to change practices, we need to do more than just assess and ask students to complete work in a particular way. And often, what I became aware of is, especially in the work, and I don't want to stay too much around this slide, but the intersection and the assumptions that because this is an intersectional theme, that's my young person. If you're seeing my screen, it's my young person connecting with me. He's off camping somewhere, so with a family friend. So he's saying, I'm alive, Mum. But this slide looks at the intersectional themes. So I think about where people come to the topic and what information exists in the education space, in the higher education space. I know that working across these axes had significant impact on me in terms of then coming to terms with the information that was available and out there about intersex. So thinking about this is really important as it brings an awareness of the complexity. And again, highlighting that intersex is not a gender identity, but certainly what we learn about gender can intersect with what we learn about ourselves and our intersex variation. And so when we're working and figuring out how to do this work, whether we're researchers or educators, there's lots of different spaces that intersect. For me, part of my learning is becoming a parent. And I've got little shoes there of my two young people and figuring out, well, how do we bring lived experiences that are respectful of who they are and who they intend to be. And so in the academic space, we talk about ontologies, epistemologies, but we also need to be thinking about that aspect that is unknown, which comes through axiology, thinking about problematizing what we already know, what is understood, bringing diversity of thought and opinion and scholarship to what we know. And I think in education, especially in teacher education, this is an important move that I think we need to make in terms of making space for the topic of intersex, and then through that, bringing awareness and visibility to the topic. And so that gives us a different way of understanding themes like sexual orientation. And this is from a sociological study. It's available through the ERA website, and it's an image that I've put in the list that you can go back and have a look. But when we look at statistical information like this and the next slide, we need to bring a critical lens. to it, and to think about, well, you know, what is this telling us? What can we learn from this? But also, what isn't in this? So one of the things that I learned is that the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, sometimes if we situate individuals and groups and communities in a particular way, we forget to see the positive. And one of the positives that I've learned by becoming a member of the community is how scholarly the community is. We've got people doing studies, people, you know, achieving great things, but often when we read about it, there's not a lot of positive stories being shared. And so coming up to, you know, intersex awareness on the 26th of October, put that in your calendars. It's really important to look for those positive stories that challenge these statistics in terms of educational outcomes, and understanding that, yes, there are issues, but there are also positive stories around education, educational achievement that we need to understand, and also understanding that the population is quite diverse, that we're not just thinking about LGBTQ, but we're also thinking about people who do choose to identify as heterosexual, because they are also part of the population. And so sometimes when we focus, and because the I is situated within the acronym, that we forget to think that there are people that don't sit in relation to that or don't identify with that acronym. And we need to be thinking about including them as well in our conversations and in our discussions. And so in the process of doing this, we're working to bring knowledge that supports individuals to talk about and make meaning and understand what they're experiencing. And it's one of the positive things that's happening in our community is that there are publications like Youth and I, and this was edited by Steph Lum, but individuals, young adults who put themselves out and share their story, you know, in a manner that educates all of us about their lived experience. Brew, who's an academic, talks about their lived experience as a person with an intersex variation, looking for knowledge and words to make meaning, and to have the capacity to talk about, you know, both to make sense of their lived experience in their private space, but even when you're going to the doctor or the psychologist, you need to have the language to actually talk about what you're experiencing in order for that service to be efficacious for you. It's really important. And, you know, if you're an English teacher, this is another great text, poetry, you know, that brings information from lived experience, and, you know, giving children an insight into what it means for different individuals to be living with a variation in sex characteristics. And so part of that story of thinking about how information sits, the different axes that we understand ourselves and others and the world, you know, we need to be thinking about that as we sort of process information, statistical information, how we situate that 1.7% in other statistical information. And what does that mean in then how we shape and define services for children, young adults, and, you know, adults in general, and families, how we direct funding. It's really important. And in particular, how we construct knowledge, ideas, and understandings through curricula. And I use a broad brush in terms when I talk about curricula, which is decided by adults. You know, we often, we saw the debates around safe schools, and what children need to know and what they should know and what they shouldn't know about their bodies. But I think it's really important that we embrace a more liberal understanding of the importance of gaining information about bodies that helps us to live more complete lives. And we know that curriculum impacts on self-image, self-concept, and self-worth. We know that, the absence of intersex content in the curriculum does impact on young people going through schooling because it renders the topic hidden. And so it leaves them to their own devices in terms of then finding knowledge and information. And it builds on that sense of silence and increases the feeling of shame because, it's very hard to then move from that silence to talk to people about what you're experiencing. So it sits within this secretive space, often without strong school-based support and resources. And so you can see the issue unfolding and why it's important that we do bring visibility and awareness to this topic. And so when we then think about free and equal and quality education and sustainable living, we have to bring in this idea that we're working for all children, including children who are born with variations in sex characteristics. That, this is a global initiative around sustainable education, sustainable living mindfully and in a healthy way on the planet for all of us. We need to be including all of us. So that allows us all to be living, in a free and equal way. We can't just use these words and bandy them around without, actually walking the talk and, taking actions that impact on lives in meaningful ways. Probably talking to the converted here, so thank you for allowing me sometimes to get on my hobby horse. I hope it's inspiring you to think in different ways. There's a lot out there that we can draw on and use. And the community has been so giving, and that's a photo of a community at a gathering in a canola field, perfect color to represent the intersex community. But I use this image to think that when we're thinking about issues relating to the rainbow family, that, and the I is included, that we do sometimes, sponsor the I, and we put the I forward when it needs to be forward. And one of the big issues is if we are funding programs, education programs, community programs, research, we need to sometimes honestly direct money to the I in a meaningful and purposeful way that does help us to actually achieve some of the goals that we're setting out to achieve, which means walking the talk in an inclusive way and truly, making a difference for the 1.7% of the population, for changing health and well-being outcomes, and therefore changing education outcomes. By understanding that, we need to, whilst we don't universalize issues and we think about the intersectionality of our lives and the lives of people born with variations in sex characteristics, so that we are inclusive with diversity in mind, with a willingness to embrace difference. And also if for my colleagues in education, and often we work, the I is included in the Australian curriculum once, but there are lots of other opportunities for that work to be done. So moving away from a tokenistic approach or a pathologizing approach is really important. And here it is the Australian curriculum, and as the intersex highlighted. I've given you the information to an article. I'm working with a group of other academics. It's in not working alone, but working with community, I think you achieve more, where we're trying to bring understanding into this space. And you can see how the curriculum moves in a positive way, but how inclusive is it of the I, so that we can promote this personal, social, and health outcomes that are lifelong. And we've started, the work has been started by this research group, in terms of thinking about what that means for schools, what that means in terms of language, resources and training, support, supportive school communities and training for teachers and so forth. So please read the article. It gives an idea of where to start, and there's work that we're doing to follow up on this article. So stay tuned. There is work happening overseas as well. And this is a project, that was done back in 2015. So the work has happened, in the past, but how is that work being brought forward, and how are we using that work to educate us? Oops, sorry, I'll go back. But in an attempt to be doing this work and to bring forward, we can see the issue of language emerging, and people who are working with young people having the language to actually do the work. But I think we have to, as I said, think critically, so that we are thinking about how we're positioning knowledge. And I've used erasure here, and instead of talking about gender inclusive biology, thinking about inclusive biology, and thinking about what, if we use the word gender, what are we actually doing? And what messages are we conveying? And are these messages problematic for the individual that is receiving these messages? When we're doing history, or we're looking at intersex back in time, or when we're looking at history in a contemporary way, what images are we using, and what impact do these images have? Setting up themes and using language, we might have a good intention, but there is an unintended outcome, and we have to start to be thoughtful about that unintended outcome in the work that we do, because there are children in the space that may relate to this content in different ways, and that content may have a negative impact on them and their growth and development and their understanding of themselves. Also, when we're working with content that's available on the web, and teachers love using the web to inform their practice, using work that's provided by the community to critique the information that's provided in the web. But I've also made the link there to Kids Helpline, making resources to children available. So if their content is triggering, that they can access counseling, they can access a service that can help them to process. So we need to, whilst we're doing this work and we're trying to think about doing this work, we need to be doing it mindfully, that is in care of the participants. Whether, and I think of participants also, when we're working on this topic with children in research, I think we also need to think about that in that space, and adults as well. Oops. I've sort of talked about the curriculum, but you can see that, we can use the curriculum and look at different points of entry, from foundation years right through to senior. There's space in the curriculum for doing this work, but we need to think about how we're going to do that work and what research is needed for us to be able to do that work mindfully, and impactfully, and also in a way that doesn't cause harm. So, as I said earlier, part of a lot of this work is around personal informed consent. And so if we, part of any individual being able to give consent to any treatment, it's about them having knowledge, information, and time to process information, time to make meaning from that information so that they can make decisions about themselves, their health and well-being, their participation in relationships and in society in general, in mindful and informed ways. And so education, and this is the goal of the reform that we're doing in Victoria around personal informed consent, but education has a big part to play in this, because we need education behind being able to make to give our informed consent, to treatment that's been proposed or otherwise. We're having conversations about what our needs are. We need to have that information. And some of the things that I think we can do in education across the curriculum, there are lots of spaces where we don't even have to talk about the topic intersex, but we can bring information that is inclusive, that is non-stigmatizing or marginalizing, that it's that allows people to have a better understanding of bodies and their own bodies, without necessarily them having to step up and say, I'm a person with an intersex variation. What can you talk about me? Of course, they have a right to do that, but there are other ways, and people can, education can play a part in educating in ways that don't require individuals to step up and identify if they don't feel they're able to, or if it's not safe for them to do so. But, we need policies in place as well that drive this work. We need staff employed in our services in education that have knowledge gained through training about what intersex actually means, that are aware of anti-bullying practices, but are also aware of intersex and intersex related issues that might be playing into those practices, anti-bullying practices and policies that we have in our schools. So I think when we're looking at these themes, it's that complexity that we need to bring in, but also finding the space and the time to actually educate ourselves about what intersex means for individuals. Oops. This is just quickly for my colleagues in the early years. We can bring this lens through the EYLF. And you can see the banners across there, how those titles provide opportunity for us to bring awareness and some kind of insight about, diversity in bodies, bodily, diversity in biology and in how bodies are, how they grow, how they develop in mindful and thoughtful ways. And, it's about what I'm doing. I'm not saying that, that's clear and it's easy, but it's about starting to think in this space and then to start to allow ourselves to think about how and with whom, and to form partnerships that are productive, that can bring knowledge and information that allows us to do this work. And the community, and there's people in our community that can step into that space to assist. Oops. And similarly, I think across all education sectors, it's thinking differently across creating, acknowledging, engaging, learning, also unlearning. We have a lot of stereotypes that drive educational practices. And I think we talk about learning a lot, but I think we need to start talking about unlearning and reframing and reimagining some of the things that we do in education to make space for thinking differently about bodies, bodily biology, bodily autonomy, self-determination, all of those things. Really important. And, a lot of the work I do through the social justice lens is bringing that element of anti-bias and asking the question, what is it about what I'm doing that holds a bias? And what do I need to do in order to eliminate that bias from what I do, and how I work with others, especially, children, young adults who are still processing and figuring out who they are in their world, and how they make sense of their bodies and bodily diversities. And I suppose in terms of what I hope for, I'm not going to play this, but in terms of what I hope for, and this is a beautiful TED talk of a mum and a young person with an intersex variation, CAH. And I suppose when I watch this, it's not a long video, so I will ask you to watch it in your own time if you but it's so inspiring, because if we do put the effort in, this is what I imagine our young people could do, the courage that they would have to understand themselves and their place in the world, and how we as adults can stand beside them and support them on that journey. And this is a beautiful relationship between, Ori and her mother standing up and telling the world about, Ori's intersex variation in a powerful and educative way. And to me, it's really inspiring, and it gives hope. And that's it for me. This is the references. So you could go to the references that I've drawn on, the images on the various slides. And if you wish to contact me to have a conversation, here's my details. And that's it.
And thank you so much, Agli. That's been a deep and rich presentation. I know that we're at 7:30 now on the east coast of Australia, but if any of you have any questions or reflections, then please do feel free to speak up. Please unmute yourself if you wish to say something. And I believe the comments in the chat are reflective of the very great presentation that you gave. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to reading those. I'm sorry, I do get caught up, and there's so much to cover. And yes, so I'm sorry that I've taken up the whole time. But yes, please post your questions, or if there's something that I've talked about that's been important for you and you want to talk further about, yes, please contact me.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I was just absolutely blown away by that whole presentation. It was absolutely amazing. But like something that really struck me was your practice and this idea of journaling and creative and art as part of your research. And I was just wondering, because I would like to do something similar, but be able to know where I've got that information from. Is there's where does that practice come from, reference wise? Or
great. Look, there's a number of sources, and one of the references that I've used earlier is the Phillips and Dunbar, which is through storing. Louise Phillips, who's somewhere in the audience, I think, and Tracy Dunbar, who's an Aboriginal woman. Their book, Storing, which is in the reference list. I'll go back and so you can, yeah, there it is, Phillips and Dunbar, research through with and as Storing. It's a Routledge publication. But also through, I use Critical Autoethnography by Boyle and Orr, Critical Autoethnography, Intersecting Cultural Identities in Everyday Life. That's a really important source. Critical autoethnographers work a lot across all sectors, health, education, even accounting, business, thinking in creative ways with complex topics that affect populations and marginalized groups. So it's, I look to the margins for methodologies rather than at the center, because I think when we look at the margins, we start to look at and learn how to work in different ways. And that circle, the spiral that I gave it, I showed at the beginning, that comes from Paulo Freire's work. And I've given you the link to that in images, which, that image came from a website used by Popular Education in working with marginalized groups, including LGBTQ groups, around various themes, and thinking about how do we work with participants in participatory research, action learning research, to actually figure out what we need to do. And so bringing the participant into the process and letting them guide you in what to do and how to shape your research. For us as an intersex community, we want you to talk to us about your research so we can bring information. And on our website, we've got some information pertaining to research with intersex populations. So I hope that's useful.
So useful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Okay. Hi, Agli. This
Hello.
is Misha. Hi, I'm Misha, and
Hi, Misha.
thank you for your presentation today. And
Sure.
I enjoyed the slides very much too. My question, and I'll say ahead of time, will be poorly formatted, but I hope you'll get the gist of it.
Sure.
Is how can recognition of intersex be integrated more fully when the recognition of intersex doesn't seem to be recognized legally? And sorry, yes, it is recognized legally, so that was poorly said, but let's say in the last census, as an example,
Right.
there wasn't, the categories are still fairly binary. And
Right.
yes, there was an extra box. But so with that in mind, can you see what I'm trying to ask?
I do. And and this is the complexity, isn't it? When, there are spaces that subjugate particular knowledge, communities, individuals, and sort of move them to the margins because it's difficult knowledge for us to work with, to think about. I suppose my message in that space is twofold. One is learning about bodies in an inclusive way that give young people, young adults, knowledge to better understand their biology as they move across their lifespan, including into old age, because there are issues that emerge in old age. And so having information that is inclusive is really important. And I think couching it in that sort of health and well-being area gives us an opportunity to talk about the topic differently to how it's been situated in other contexts that often renders it problematic. But it also understanding that, when we talk about intersex, that there is knowledge in the community that you can draw on to support a service, a project, an activity, so making sure that the knowledge you're bringing into the work you're doing has gone through a critical lens, that it actually is affirming and it's actually aligned with the principles of human rights is really important as well. And I think if we start in different ways, we will shift. And I think part of doing any social justice work, and if we look back in history, it all starts with the effort and the will to make a difference by individuals in their context, teachers in their classroom. We've seen, through different kinds of movements on, race,
It's-
ethnicity, language, that it's teachers actually stepping up, informing themselves in the first place, being really aware of and taking time to think about the complexities, that idea of slow and good scholarship.
So I guess we're relying still at the moment, we'll still rely on people calling on either their story or their courage, whether that's a teacher, a parent, a lawyer, it doesn't really matter, until such time as the language is clearer and stronger across the community, where it's simply accepted and known.
And there is language there that can be used, and it's language that we've worked through to make it accessible, and we're continuing to do that work. And ERA's engaged with work building resources. So stay tuned to the ERA webpage, and because we're building that up all the time with knowledge and information.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Agli. Thank you, everyone. I think it's almost 7:45.
It is.
So perhaps it's time to wrap up, and thank you all for being here. Some of you have stayed to the very end, and I hope that you found this all really useful. Please do take a look at the ERA website. We've got guidance there on inclusive practice and also on how to count people with intersex variations in the census, on forms and other documents, in ways that respect the diversity of the population. So I hope you might find that helpful. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
And good night.
Thank you all. Take care and stay safe.
Yeah, please, people can email me.